Hi, everyone. I'm a bit old school, so I'm going to read. I would like to bear with me because that's a personal experience that I'm going to share, and it took me a good 3 years to process that. So I still remember the day I decided to apply for psychoanalytic training. After a year of abusive working conditions as a lecturer at the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute here at the university, I felt a sense of excitement at the possibility of moving towards the practice of psychoanalysis. For me, this was also imagined as a break, a way of undoing and, in some sense, dismantling the forms of psychological practice that I had come to reject. Ironically, as someone who understood herself as anti-psychologist, committed to abolishing the individualizing, pathologizing, and imperial formations of psychology, I held on to the fantasy that psychoanalysis might exist as a uniquely radical space oriented toward liberation. I had been intellectually and politically shaped in environments alongside people like Ian Parker and Lara Seahai, whose work and political commitments have come at a personal cost, and whose models of practice remained attuned to political positions that white liberal academia so often disavows, surveils, and criminalizes, or perhaps even worse, repackages into palatable agendas of equality and diversity. The first rupture in this fantasy came with the £150 fee required to simply to apply and be considered for an interview. This initial demand already signaled a different set of values at work. At this early stage, what appeared administrative already began to reveal the institutional conditions under which psychoanalysis reproduces itself long before any clinical encounter had formally begun. Having perhaps naively articulated my reasons for applying and having spoken openly about how I imagined this training as a radical space, one that holds political questions as central and alive, I assumed that this would be enough. I thought that my commitment, my positioning, and my desire to practice otherwise would be recognized on their own terms. The administrative email confirmed that I had been invited for an interview, but specified that I would need to meet with 2 members of the training committee. I was informed that an online option was not available and the interviews would have to take place in person. I agreed, arranging to travel to London to meet the 2 analysts, my interviewers, for what I understood at that point to be a straightforward interview process. When I arrived outside the door of the first interview, I tried not to let myself be unsettled by the fact that this was a private home, presumably where the analyst lived with her family. Still, I was already uncomfortable in the white, affluent neighborhood in North London. As I climbed the stairs toward what it seemed to be a living room, I couldn't stop thinking that even the frame of her mirror was probably worth more than my entire savings. I told myself to be quiet, to behave. Sitting on her sofa, anxious not to make a mistake or spill anything, I watched as she took her seat opposite to me and simply invited me to begin. I was taken aback. Almost immediately, I felt as though I had been placed in an analytic session. I couldn't understand what was happening. She watched me closely, nodding at the slightest movement, while I became increasingly guarded. My defenses were already up. I felt caught off guard, even tricked. At the time, I didn't yet understand that when a psychoanalytic training invites you for an interview, it can entail a deep excavation of your life, both personal, professional, and political, in order to evidence your desire to train, and more specifically, your desire to train with them, with their institution. I found myself being pressed on the ways I spoke about my trajectory, particularly my insistence, perhaps in her eyes, naive or misplaced, that this was the moment for me to train as an analyst rather than a psychotherapist. This seemed to unsettle her. She probed repeatedly, attempting to make sense of my rejection of psychology and to account for how I had come to be sitting there in her space. She pressed me to justify my insistence that psychoanalysis is distinct from psychotherapy, interrogating rather than engaging with the ways I understood psychoanalysis as a practice of freedom. At the same time, there was a palpable effort to steer me, to draw out from my speech something recognizable, something that could be taken up with her own therapeutic framework. It felt as though my words were being listened to less for what they expressed and more for how they might be translated into familiar signifiers. My difference in political positioning began to be be psychologized, recast within a narrative of defense. I was not yet prepared to hold steady against the political interrogation disguised in psychotherapeutic terms. As the conversation around therapy fell into the cracks, it seemed to search for another way to make me confess. It was here that the interview took on the tone of an analytic interrogation. I still cannot forget the moment she asked, almost out of nowhere, that I share something from my childhood. The question struck me immediately. I couldn't understand why it mattered or how, within what had been presented as an interview, someone could feel so entitled to open up questions of my past, my history, my life trajectory, only to let them drop an hour later with no sense of continuity, care, or responsibility, and without knowing whether we would ever meet again. I found myself wondering why this could be justified as an ethical encounter within an interviewing framework. I found myself caught in an uneasy irony. Even as I resisted the language of professional guidelines, I couldn't help but question the ethics of what was taking place. How could this be understood as ethical, let alone as an ethics of care? To invite such exposure and then send me back out in the cold detachment of that North London neighborhood felt less like care and more like extraction. It was clear that our worlds were very different. I was also deeply unprepared. I hadn't fully understood that an interview could take shape as a form of extraction. Things became even more charged when she began asking where I lived, how I planned to travel to London for the training, and what my plans were for living and remaining in the UK. As a scholar of critical migration studies, and through my experience as both a humanitarian aid worker and researcher, I have come to understand that questions around futurity and settlement, when directed at migrants within an imperial context, function as a way of assessing belonging, stability, and legitimacy. I can still recall the nausea I felt. My immediate thought was, imagine how my Black comrades and racialized subjects in the UK in general are made to feel under the wide imperial and liberal gaze. How was it possible that she felt entitled to ask these questions? Would she ever ask that someone who was white British? To this day, my disgust toward that encounter and towards those who sustain their power within such institutions remains still difficult to articulate. I'm not convinced to realize what she was asking. I suspect she believed it was reasonable, even necessary, to ask about my plans as a way of assessing my commitment to the training without any consideration of my multiple positionalities, including my location as a migrant within an empire. As if that were not enough, my naivety in being honest, disclosing that I was looking for work, but had made sure to stay for the training, seemed to be taken up as further justification for my eventual exclusion. Questions about whether I was planning to move to London and how I would manage the commute were framed as practical concerns, yet they carried an implicit assumption that the training was geared toward the already affluent, despite the well-known reality that many people commute. This became clearer later when I was rejected from the training and I was invited to a feedback session to explain their decision. Interestingly, although a member of the training committee and the second interviewer were present, she was not. While they stated that I was not ready to enter the training, they also carefully raised two striking issues. The first was my financial situation. In Polish, white liberal, of course, language, they suggested that it would be risky for me to begin the training and potentially have to stop for various reasons, thinly veiled references to financial instability. I asked directly whether the training was in effect only accessible to the upper classes, returning them to their own claims of political commitment and questioning how such commitments could be sustained without ensuring access from people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. It goes without saying that my direct questioning was interpreted as a defense, and it was at this point that they introduced the second line of critique. During the interviews, I was asked how I experienced myself in groups. I wanted so much to be accepted into the training that I had promised myself to be completely honest in these so-called interviews. So when they asked, I responded that I have spent my entire life in groups, and yet I still feel uncomfortable. For me, this recurring discomfort was not a deficiency, but a sign of persistence, of continuing to show up again and again out of political commitment more than anything else. It was not something to be corrected, but something to be understood. However, during the feedback session, they suggested that it might have been better for me to take a 1-year introductory course elsewhere to familiarize myself with groups. Even now, I find it difficult to accept this. I had thought that with time, my rage might soften, but it has not. I still cannot believe that an institution claiming political commitments in relation to psychoanalysis would suggest that someone requires training in being in groups, as though this were a deficit. Our lives are already constituted through sociality, and in fact, psychoanalytic training and practice are themselves largely structured around one-to-one encounters. But the irony felt endless. During these interviews, I was trying to argue that psychoanalysis can and should be a practice of freedom, rather than a white liberal clinical plaster that sends you back into the world only slightly less distressed. For me, it must be linked to feminist, anti-racist, and of course, anti-colonial commitments. To my surprise, although the second interviewer was more measured, she was also to some extent more honest. She acknowledged that she had been asked by the institution to pose and pursue a particular line of questioning. I felt a momentary sense of relief when she agreed that psychoanalytic thinking is not limited to bloody Freud, Klein, and Winnicott or others, but also includes figures such as Fanon, thinkers of anti-colonial armed resistance activists who radically expand the field. Yet, a year later, as the genocide in Palestine unfolded and the white liberalism and both-sidism rhetoric of universities and institutions became increasingly visible, I found myself unable to reconcile this. I couldn't believe that someone who read Fanon could also participate in and mobilize the very forms of reasoning that were ultimately used to justify my rejection from the training. What I came to understand through this encounter is that interview did not simply assess suitability for psychoanalytic training. It actively produced a demand for eligibility and compliance as you tiptoe within the doorsteps of the institution. Across each moment, the excavation of my childhood memory, the probing of my migration trajectory, the assessment of my fit within groups, and the financial framing of risk, what was being sought was not only knowledge about me, but my translation into a form that could be recognized, contained, and institutionally assimilated. What could not be easily translated, refusal, rage, political insistence, anti-colonial positioning, even as a white person, was repeatedly recast as a defense, immaturity, or lack of preparedness. This begins to resonate with a broader critique of psychoanalytic institutions as sites of containment, regulation, and professional reproduction. As Carter J. Carter argues in their critique of psychoanalytic institutes, these institutions function as dams on the psychoanalytic river, structures that do not merely transmit knowledge, but actively constrain, filter, and regulate who and what can enter the field. In this framing, institutes are not neutral spaces of training, of course, but institutional formations that often produce iatrogenic effects, reproducing harm through the very mechanisms that claim to offer care, insight, and ethical development. From this perspective, psychoanalysis becomes increasingly organized through gatekeeping practices that privilege conformity, legibility, and institutional recognizability over political or epistemic dissent, while foreclosing more radical or collective forms of resistance in favor of professionalized and individualized pathways. It is here that I begin to think through what I conceptualize as the psychoanalysis of refusal, a psychoanalysis that does not name withdrawal from encounter, nor does it signify resistance as pathology or non-compliance. Rather, it names a critical and ethical orientation that interrupts the demand of psychological legibility itself, the requirement that suffering, anger, or political analysis should be rendered intelligible within institutional frameworks in order to be recognized as valid. A psychoanalysis of refusal refuses the conversion of structural violence into intrapsychic deficit. It insists that what is often read as resistance, silence, opacity, anger, insistence, or refusal to narrativize the self in sanctioned terms may instead be an ethical response to conditions of extraction. In this sense, refusal is not absence of engagement, but a refusal of the terms through which engagement is made possible. Of course, this is not my own words on intellectual trajectory. It comes and draws on anti-colonial psychoanalytic and decolonial thinkers, particularly Lara Sihai's articulation of refusal as a response to psychoaffective colonial demands for exposure, confession, and transformability. In this account, what appears as defensiveness or non-cooperation is reread as an ethical stance against psychic extraction, a refusal to be rendered fully transparent, interpretable, and usable for institutional and epistemic control. From this perspective, refusal is not an obstacle to care, but a condition for its ethical possibility. It reorients care away from penetration, interpretation, and correction, and towards an ethics of restraint, one that does not require the other to become fully knowable to be recognized as such. It resonates with Fanon's insistence that psychic life cannot be disentangled from colonial relations of force, and with broader feminist and anti-colonial critiques that link healing to structural transformation rather than individual adjustment. A psychoanalysis of refusal therefore insists on reconnecting stories with history, psychic suffering with political responsibility and resistance, and care with material and colonial accountability. It asks psychoanalysis to confront its own implication in regimes of extraction, where the demand for disclosure often masks differ asymmetries of power, class, race, gender, and institutional authority. It is from that point that I turn to a psychoanalysis of refusal, one that does not seek to perfect the terms of recognition, but to unsettle them entirely. Thank you.